Thank you, Heather. It's my pleasure this afternoon or this morning, depending where you are, to talk about the current and the mid-21st century geoscience workforce, basically a snapshot of what we're seeing in the workforce program at AGI. I'd also like to acknowledge my colleagues in the program, Carolyn Wilson, who's our data analyst, and a lot of credit for a lot of the data that is presented here today, and Heather Holton, who deals with a lot of the student to workforce and professional development issues. So I want to first take a look at a snapshot of what's going on today, basically built around thoughts, but also some of the anecdotal and other conversational points that we get here at AGI as questions from the community as issues arise. Most of this is framed from a U.S. perspective. That certainly is the network that we have the strongest connection, but we will be talking about some of the international connections as well. So the first thing I want to talk about is enrollments, and invariably on almost every category of workforce data and information, we hear a lot from the community. We have a lot of conversations, and right now I'd say the big buzz that we're hearing about enrollments is that there's a perception that undergraduate enrollments are noticeably declining after this boom that we've had over the last couple years. So when we look at the data, and we have brand new fresh data for 2017 that we just worked on and completed this week, that's not necessarily exactly what we're seeing. A couple things to note: our current year data is always preliminary, and then the year prior, when we do the updates, is basically revised. If you recall the last year's enrollment chart, there was a decline in 2016. That's actually been corrected up a fair bit, with additional reporting from departments this year, and we've seen pretty much a steady state at the undergraduate enrollment level. One of the big things that's going on is we've noticed a lot of departments actually are reporting declines within their program, particularly mid-sized departments between, say, 30 and 75 majors. They are seeing, maybe an erosion of 5 to 10 majors in the last year or two. But what we're also seeing are a number of departments that have grown very substantially, and the additional component that a lot of new online-only degree programs are being launched, and we're seeing substantial enrollments in those. Some of these are have on the order of 800 students as enrolled majors. So that is actually one of the big dynamics that we're seeing. A chunk of this undergraduate growth is actually in this online environment. Actually, within the online component, we're underestimating because we've actually witnessed a number of the earlier programs where geoscience departments launched these programs. Those programs have actually been removed from their department and moved into the colleges of, distance education, things like that. So they're no longer even counting those majors. So there's a lot of dynamics going on in the undergraduate level. At the graduate level, we're seeing things just sort of going along fairly steady. Again, sort of representing what looks like a carrying capacity of U.S. programs. When we look at the degrees granted, the latest data we have, we see the substantial increase in our number of bachelors granted this year. I don't think that's particularly surprising. We've been having all this growth in the number of majors, so they're starting to actually get their way through the system. Likewise, we saw a bit of an increase in the masters this year after a little lull last year. I think that's just some of the normal ebb and flow. But what was most interesting is we saw a 16% increase in the number of PhDs awarded. One thing that we feel may be leading to that is, before we had a bit of attrition out of graduate programs, folks that may have been PhD bound, who then instead flipped over, took their masters, and left. But with the softening of the job market in the oil and gas industry, that trend may be in the process of changing, and we're starting to see folks push through with their doctorates. So just some of the issues to consider, when we think about enrollments. I've hit most of these, key points. But I think one of my biggest concerns is that the data itself that we're seeing, the raw data at an aggregate level, isn't necessarily reflecting the sentiment. I feel like we're hearing a lot of very negative sentiment towards where enrollments are going. And I think that is probably by actual programs. The number of programs that are being, seeing declines is probably, fairly substantial. but we have areas where there's a lot of growth. I think this is a bit reflective that the geosciences has been a little late into some of the innovation in enrollment through degree and certificate programs, things like that. And so as what constitutes a higher education community is actually starting to shift and isn't necessarily totally reflected in our perspective from a traditional enrollment standpoint. So, one of the other questions is, what is the quality of these students and the graduates? And what I'm hearing, and this is very consistent from, invariable really based on the size of the degree programs, and we're hearing the same reflection from a lot of employers, is that the top 15, 20% of students are not just really good, they're the best a lot of these people have ever seen in their careers. These are outstanding students of unparalleled quality. But one of the challenges is that the next step down, as soon as you move out of that top tier, the quality seems to be pretty marginal as far as maybe it's a scholastic aptitude, the commitment to the studies, perhaps some of those key components that we feel as far as spatial reasoning and those other components. But these students definitely struggle, and there seems to be a lot of frustration with that. Now, there is some data that actually supports that. This data is slightly dated. Carolyn is working on the new status of the geoscience workforce report, which will hopefully have new updated data. This stuff is very slow to come out. But as you can see from the red line, geology majors, their SAT, as imperfect as it is, it's the one proxy we have. The SAT math scores, geology majors aren't just the lowest of STEM, but they're well below the college average. And I think that should be a very substantial concern for all of us, that we're not necessarily recruiting the best and brightest into our programs. I think the other thing that you see is we have some unique features, obviously, things like the expectation of a comprehensive field experience within the course of an undergraduate education. We still see roughly about half of our undergraduates not having that kind of experience. And again, is it a barrier? Is it a lack of interest in that sort of capstone integrative experience, or are there other barriers that are preventing our students from completing that and maybe not giving them that synthesis opportunity that I think many of us in the community feel is important? And then the other side, this has been brought up many times. From our data, we've heard plenty of other folks talk about this. Particularly when you look at the undergraduate level, our quantitative skills are very poor on average, among our students. I wouldn't say that they're exactly stellar at the graduate level either. One of the concerns being is, when you extend this forward, many of these advanced math skills, like linear algebra, differential equations, are actually very important in understanding the concepts that are applied out in the workplace. So if you're working in fluids, the ability to understand and conceptualize the principles within differential equations is important. Likewise, linear algebra, to understand how a complex multivariate system actually works and interacts, is again, it may not be in the actual process, but actually in the conceptualizations that are really critical. And then the other issue, as we use more and more models and increased reliance on computing, folks not understanding a lot of the basic principles and computational methods and some of the key caveats when you're actually working with numeric data, in a computing environment and how that works. So things to consider about the student and graduate quality. I mean, I think it's a very serious question. Are we recruiting the best talent at the start? We are at a disadvantage. The physics community is very open about this. I think the math community is too. Our majors all have to go to their departments at some point early on, so our best students are easy targets to recruit. So how do we recruit their students? How do we get their best students over to consider a major in geoscience? I think there is the question whether the current curriculum requirements are meeting the needs of the market. That obviously gets into the debate of education versus training. But I can tell you from the sentiment that we've heard In the exit survey, the Geoscience Graduate Exit Survey, students are very much job oriented, so I think that needs to be considered. Uh, and I think this whole issue that our programs can be rigorous, maybe they need to even be more rigorous. And if you want a career and work in this profession, you're going to have to go through a rigorous process. There's not an easy pathway. But I think it does bring up the other question: Are our students or your students actually career motivated? I think it's perfectly fair. We see a lot of that in the exit survey. Most of the students responding are career motivated, but I think there is a very good argument out there, and has been made by folks like Ed Roy a number of years ago, and has been propagated forward, that geoscience makes for a really good liberal arts degree as well. So there may be other motivations and drivers, and I think this is one of those key questions within a department. Are you being successful? Are you actually embracing and supporting what the motivations of the students are, what they want out of your program? Employment. This is the one everyone always worries the most about, particularly students and new graduates. What is the current buzz we're seeing? The job market has tightened up a lot. This is certainly what we're hearing from folks, and that the graduates are reporting they're not readily finding employment like they were over the last couple of years, and that there's a lot of frustration. I'd say the students today are even more career focused than they have been in the past. I think some of this is fair to make because we have seen softening in the job market, but I think, as we also saw, we now have a substantial increase in the number of degree holders entering into the job market in the geosciences. So the competition has actually become a lot stronger as well. And as you can see with this diagram, basically there are origin points on the left are the degree fields that folks over the last, I believe this is the last 3 years, have received their degrees, and then on the right in the gray are the target employment areas that they've entered. And as you can see, it is still dominated by solid earth geosciences, and certainly dominated by employment in the oil, gas, and increasingly in the environmental services sectors. So I think the aggregate structure that we see for employment and where people are going is not necessarily changing, but it is still good to reaffirm that overall system is fairly consistent. But that doesn't mean that the devils aren't in the details. So in the current geoscience graduate exit survey, we find out where students are getting, the graduates are getting their jobs by sector. In this case, for the bachelor's recipients, as you can see, for comparison, I have 2014, which was sort of at the peak of the crazy hiring. There was even a lot of undergraduates going into oil and gas. Today, it's down to 5%. So you see that constraint, within that sector. The environmental services sector continues to be a major employer. The other thing that we see is a continued strong employment by federal government. A lot of this seems to be at the technician level. They have seen a lot of retirements, and within a lot of the budget structures that have been placed in federal agencies, it has not precluded the hiring of these more junior level technical positions compared to some of the more senior research positions. However, when we get to the graduate level, we are seeing very substantial changes in the near term in what we're seeing as far as the hiring profile of new graduates. Again, you can see how basically the high energy level of hiring that was occurring in oil and gas at the master's level. This has traditionally been the case, that it's at least always been at least over 50%. In my 20 plus years looking at this data, this is the first time I've ever seen it below 50%. And it has contracted all the way down to 28, as you can see. Likewise, environmental services, picked up a little bit of the slack, but the federal government expanded substantially. And again, these are mostly folks that are moving in, replacing folks in retirement at the federal level. And then when you look at the doctorate level, oil and gas have been hiring actually at a fairly healthy clip. Obviously, the four-year university, which does include postdocs, has been a major employer as well. What's most interesting in this last year is the fact that the federal government hiring has all intent and purposes has evaporated for those, those actual research positions. I don't think that's a surprise to anyone, but it is certainly something to keep in mind as you may have students that are finishing up their doctorate research in this current federal budgetary climate. So things to consider employment. Yes, the job market's gotten soft with hiring and oil and gas definitely down. Uncertainty about, with the current administration, uncertainty about environmental regulations seems to have softened the environmental sector. But the other side of the environmental sector has just gone through about 10 years of really heavy hiring. Mining has been a bright spot, but their hiring rate has also been tempered by technological advances, which we'll get to in a few minutes. We still seem to have an issue with students recognizing the spatial dependency of geoscience employment. And I think that's a challenge. I think there's a question about some of the level of advising that's going on early on for expectations of students to understand that, it's not like an accountant or a doctor or, or some of these other kinds of fields where they're pretty much in every town, and that their employment opportunities may be more limited depending on their specific interests. The other thing too is understanding that people aren't always not hired for just one reason. I mean, yes, sometimes the jobs are not available. We had a huge influx of new graduates into a softer market. But the other question is, in a lot of cases, we do hear this from employers, is they're still not necessarily finding sufficient numbers of folks with the right talent set. And so if there's that mismatch, we seem to have problems. In general, most of the programs I've talked to said that their best students are not having any problems landing employment. It's when you sort of get into what they would say was the lower half of the achieving students. So diversity. This is always a very tough topic to wrestle. It remains an intractable problem. I suspect most folks that are on this webinar were aware of the comment in Nature Geoscience the other week. It created a fair bit of buzz and got picked up broad and wide, and there were some very unkind comments made about the geosciences, made my skin crawl. But there's a certain truth to it, and I can tell you, my physics colleagues, especially, they're very they have a lot of gratitude that the geosciences exist because we make them look good on the diversity field. They know that they're struggling, but our diversity issues remain a substantial challenge. And I think one of the things that we have to consider is we have a couple key differences than a lot of fields. One of them is we have some substantial co-curricular costs. Again, back to field camp. Are people aware of this and ready? Is this a negative input in our ability to recruit students that may not otherwise have just been a natural fit and motivated from the very beginning to pursue a geoscience degree? And I think the other issue is the challenges of mobility and where the job availability is. Dallas Rhodes, when he was at Georgia Southern University, did a terrific study about minority populations in higher education and where they mapped relative to geoscience departments, and he found some strong mismatches. And if you look at the maps he developed, you would see similar kinds of patterns here as far as where the geoscience jobs are. It's a little hard to build some of those connections if we don't have the sort of the community recognition in place as well. So I think there's some other things to really give consideration when we have the conversation about diversity, because I mean it is a hot button issue. But as anyone that's been trying to track diversity for any period of time recognizes that 2010 was a watershed moment. It's become nearly impossible to have meaningful statistics on diversity in a population, and largely that was the introduction of multiracial classification. So it no longer is what your primary ethnic or racial identity is. And instead, it's sort of this: you can pick what you want, approach, and it's a bit hard to understand what then represents the criteria for a minority. The other side of it is there's been a fair number of studies that have actually shown that folks now are actually changing their response, that ethnicity is in essence a fluid issue, and that if they feel their economic outlook is positive, they tend to actually, respond that they're Caucasian, and that folks that maybe feel that their economic outlook is not so good, that they're actually going to report themselves into some of the minority groups, irrespective of what their actual what we would define as identity actually should be. So basically that kind of measures, those kinds of measures have become very, very hard. I think we have to ask our question, what are our motivations, particularly with this? Are we trying to check boxes? Or do we have goals? Are we trying to say we want X percentage of each of these, populations as part of our community? Or are we actually trying to transform our discipline at a more fundamental level that it's fully representative of our entire population? And if that's the case, and I hope it is, but we have a really big hill to climb, because we pull 91% of our students, 91% of our students basically have a parent who attended college. That's only of parents of college age students, that's only 12% of the US population. So we're pulling 91% of our students from at best 12% of the population. So that at the very get-go is a gargantuan problem in promoting diversity. We're just completely misaligned. And I think, if it is about engaging the whole population, then we have to really be thinking much harder about not targeting into specific, ethnic, categories, ethnic and racial categories, or, disabilities or whatever, but actually look at these first generation college students. Look at the folks that are trying to enter this, the higher education market, and support them. And I think that's one of those key questions that, or discussions that the community needs to have. And I think that becomes where the issues of things like field cam and spatial dependency become really, really key, because when you read read research about first generation college students, they face, substantially greater barriers on finances, on family pressures. A lot of them, they may have children or supporting parents, or, have other spatial dependencies. They can't really leave, their hometown. So they face a lot of other additional challenges that may be counter to engaging in a more traditional geoscience education pathway. Okay, so that is a look at the current snapshot. Like to spend a few minutes trying to peer into the future and looking at some of the disruptions that I think are going on right now, that will probably, influence our future workforce. And so why did I say the mid-21st century workforce? And really this comes down to that the current geoscience major will be the experienced practicing professional into the 2060s. So our education system right now is preparing that entire mid-21st century workforce. But we're starting to see some substantial changes, and I think, are we in the process of tweaking or supporting these students as they enter the workforce to be ready and adaptable into this evolving market? So the first thing I'm going to make an argument for is we need to actually adopt a 21st century vernacular. And, even us within the workforce program here at AGI, we need to do a better job of this as well. I think traditionally when you look at the sort of the industry disciplinary interfaces, we think about oil and gas, mining, environmental as these big ones. And then you get into the research portfolio, basically, within academia and government organizations. But I would argue that what we really need to be looking at is energy, because it's broad. We're seeing geoscientists active not just in petroleum. Oil and gas is going to be a major component of the geosciences for decades and decades and decades to come. But there's a lot of activity going in within the renewable sector in which geoscientists are having an active role. Likewise, in mining, the Europeans have just invested tens of billions of euros into raw materials. And that includes mining, but as we've engaged with them, it includes recycling, scrap recovery, secondary recovery out of waste, all kinds of different processes. And one of the things that's been interesting is the technology and knowledge transfer between what we understand in geoscience into these other sectors is really important. There are some pretty interesting problems within recycling that they face with the use of nano coatings on like aluminum and in tin cans that are making recycling almost impossible. But you really look at what the problem is they're trying to solve. It's really a geochemistry style problem. So there are these interesting opportunities for us to work across a lot. And I think thinking about raw materials writ large is again an opportunity for us. I think our traditional use of the term environmental has done a great disservice, largely because I don't think there is a field in geosciences in the professional side that is more rough and tumble than probably the environmental community. But yet I think our students think warm, fuzzy, and you know, pretty flowers, not mud and wet, and lots of doing lots of tough remediation and assessment services. I think what we have to do is be calling them professional services. And most of these environmental firms are also engineering and basically do a wide range, bringing geoscience into a very wide range of problem sets. And I think this is something that we need to be trying to tweak our vernacular a bit about and help students understand what they're actually pursuing. I would argue that change is afoot. As I said before, I've looked at this information, been monitoring the geoscience workforce for 2 decades, and there's clearly a lot of fundamental changes that are occurring, particularly up the workforce chain, not necessarily in higher education, but up in the employment sectors. And there's sort of these 3 big areas that I think are going to define a lot of the 21st century workforce environment. One is this globalization mobility of labor. This sounds like an old topic, but the reality is it was a hot topic, but now it's actually becoming very real and very impactful. Talk about that in a second. The other is how automation is now starting to impact white collar professions. This isn't just simply robots replacing folks on a factory floor. And the other is that there seem to be changes in the activities of what actually folks do when they're working in geoscience. And we're starting to see, particularly like in mining, starting to see some of these things come up, and it's going to influence what our current students are going to be doing in their career. So, I think this global challenge is a key issue. When you look at China, India, and Indonesia combined, they have 65 million students in undergraduate programs currently. You compare that to the US, we have 20 million, only 13 million of those are in 4-year programs. One of the key things that you hear from folks in industry, you see from folks that are editors of journals even, the quality of the output that you see coming out of particularly China, but also India and Indonesia have improved substantially. These are now becoming world-class individuals in their training, and basically represent a very fertile source of employment in the future. And then, we're already sort of at just a bulk population disadvantage, and then we obviously already have isolated ourselves to only recruiting out of 12%. We need to find ways to better make sure that we're tapping that entire 20 million college students that are in school right now. So, I mean, part of the point, this flow map here, this is actually fairly dated. We did this in 2010 as part of an IUGS task force, trying to look about where geoscience talent moved, where the sources and sinks were. And we did this October 2010. We tried to do it again 6 months later, and then again the following 6 months. And what we discovered was it changed so substantially all the time. It really was not a good exercise because of different political conditions and economic conditions changing in countries. But the only thing that remained constant was there was a constant flow and migration of geoscience talent across the world. So, the idea that it's a global workforce, particularly in the private sector, is very, very real. And I just, and this gets us back to the whole thing where we see the debate about, is there a STEM shortage, is there not? And this has been, beaten to death, but largely it depends on whether you classify scientists or only folks with PhDs, or if you're willing to accept folks with bachelor's and master's. If it's only PhDs, there's more than enough, STEM workers. If it's the whole population, then no, there does seem to be plenty of opportunities. But again, one of the biggest things is whether or not these folks are qualified individuals. And when you look at that, and we look at the numbers that come out of BLS, we're looking at a little over 300,000 geoscientists that are working in the United States. We assume that these are qualified individuals to certainly some level. And that one of the key things, particularly the third point here, is the fact that BLS continues to show a shortage of 90,000 full-time equivalents by 2024. So, we have a lot of attrition, because of retirements, but they're still showing a net growth. I think one of the key things is that net growth is being driven by aggregate growth of the U.S. economy. There's an assumption that there's a specific demand for geoscientists because the economy grows. And they're only looking at geoscience and growing by a small fraction of a percent faster than the U.S. Than the U.S. economy. So we basically have in essence this predicted shortage, but we're also seeing softness in the job market. So how do we rectify these contradictions? And we've talked about this, a lot, at AGI and have presented in various different ways. But I think one of the key things is we need to back up about how labor demand is actually estimated. And the reality is it's based on expected economic activity, and that a given person in a profession can be allocated an expectation of producing a certain amount of economic activity. And so there's your total FTE equivalence. And within that, you can accommodate for that economic activity in 4 ways. You can actually hire the person in that profession, the geoscientist. You can use substitution. You can hire an engineer or an accountant or whatever to come up with the same answers that the geoscientist would have been doing within that work. The other thing is if you cannot get the talent, then you have foregone economic activity. So there's an expected economic activity, and then perhaps your actual achievement is going to be less because the talent wasn't there. But the other one is innovation. And innovation basically means, are you making your workers more efficient? In essence, can you increase their capacity, and that would then drive down FTEs. And as we've monitored this, we've seen innovation chip away at those FTE numbers in BLS, but their models run a little bit slower, than reality. There's a couple year delay. And so one of the things that we're seeing, and this has been, become a big topic, particularly in the mining sector, increasingly in downstream and oil and gas, is the rise of machine learning and geoscience. And one of the big things that this has done is to make the geoscientists a lot more efficient. So in essence, as we'll talk about in a mining case, you could see up to a 5-fold increase in the efficiency, the economic productivity of a geoscientist. So innovation, if the opportunity arises, can displace a lot of the actual people within that FTE. And I think this is going to be one of those key drivers about, what that future geoscience workforce is going to really look like, and what the dynamics are that our current students are going to be working through for their career. So what's actually driving innovation in geoscience that's offsetting labor demand? And it really comes down cheap computing. Things like Amazon Web Services and Azure are actually game changers. It's very cheap to have your own supercomputer if you need to. And then basically new and emerging machine learning approaches, techniques that have only been around for 18 months are finding new applications. So to step through sort of an example here, talk about the mining industry and machine learning. So the mining industry, a number of the companies have done studies, and they looked at what their geoscientists were spending their time doing. And across about 4 or 5 different companies, they came up with the same numbers. Between 80 and 82% of the time of their geoscientists was being spent searching, cleaning, and prepping data for analysis. So they were only getting 15% or so of their time using their actual domain expertise solving geologic problems. So one of the companies, Goldcorp, they invested $1 billion with IBM to find ways to reduce that 80 to 82% as much as possible. They want their geologists doing geology. And in the end, it's actually produced a new product, which is supposed to become publicly available June 1st. called Watson for Natural Resources. So it's a platform of efforts to help mining and oil and gas companies work with their data and improve the analytic capabilities of their geoscience teams. It had been pointed out that even minus this major investment, many of the companies have been implementing various components of machine learning in their within their workflow, and that the estimate was about 100,000 geoscientists and engineering jobs in the gold industry have been lost in the last 5 years or so worldwide. These are high value jobs, obviously, lost in many different corners of the globe. And it's basically through automation. The other aspect too that's sort of becoming an emerging and interesting skill is drone expertise, both in the mining and environmental employment area. I'm sure the oil and gas industry will get there too in spades. So we're seeing a lot of these different technologies coming in and becoming part of this broader tool set. So one of the things that I've noticed is, within Geo, there is a community that's very heavy looking at machine learning opportunities, but there's a very large component that hasn't. And I think part of the question is how does this impact our career things? And the reality is where machine learning right now in the current state of the art works extremely well is if it boils down to pattern matching identification. Then it's basically readily automatable. And some of the simplest machine learning processes like kernel vector machines are really good at this pattern matching kind of process and classifying, what people are seeing. So, whether it's in core logging or seismic interpretation or any of these kinds of processes that we do regularly as geoscientists that are pattern matching. I mean, think about how important we view analogs. Is basically becomes automatable for the vast majority that are fairly standard and rudimentary, predictable kinds of outcomes. And so is it effective? So Goldcorp did an assessment, doing their Watson platform. And so they came up with a set of contrived problems. And what they found is it was so they had a team of senior geoscientists posed with the same problem that they gave Watson in its entire analytic portfolio of capabilities. And they found that Watson, in essence, came to the solution 35 times faster than the geoscientist team, largely because it was so effective at managing all that data and combining it, integrating it, and aligning it in analytic methodologies and getting the visualization done. That basically increase the efficiency. The biggest key point is that Watson also was smart enough to flag things that made no sense, where there were issues. And invariably, those were the interesting things that had a geologic problem that needed to be addressed by a human being. Then they actually encountered their first real world problem when their board asked a specific question about some of their gold holdings, wanting to understand the distribution of concentrations. And so they thought, hey, this is great, let's try it. And so their senior geoscience team spent 1,080 person hours to solve the problem. And they had all their data, all the advanced tools that they usually have, and almost all that time was in data management and processing. Watson for Natural Resources did it in 14 minutes. So it was pretty obvious to them that this is a big issue. But I would say Goldcorp wasn't viewing this as a way to get rid of a lot of geoscientists. The way they look at this is what they want to do is make this help the geoscientists basically be augmented. So they're not doing so much of the rudimentary work. So is it really a threat? And I'd say it's only if we don't evolve. What we will see are traditional occupations like loggers and interpreters and things like that, which a lot of folks go out, graduate with their geology and bachelor's or master's, and they go do. Are probably going to disappear. It's going to be harder to move up the chain without those mid-step careers. And again, it's about creating this augmented geoscientist who really can focus on the geologic problem solving using this robust tool set. So it's really changing what we do. So what are the impacts? What do we think these broad impacts are? So the first thing I just want to propose is if you have a traditional view of labor classes, and I hate this because it's like a caste system, but if we call it geoscience experience on the vertical, basically folks move up, they have their discipline areas, and there's increasing skills, and probably not as many people at the top with the best skills. But there's what they call the middle skill area, and these are the folks that are doing a lot of the day-to-day geoscience uh, work, and basic analysis and things like that. Not necessarily dealing with the hardest problems, and certainly not necessarily dealing with the simplest, but or sort of just the bulk of the workforce. And so what I'm proposing as sort of a straw man out there is, as we see these middle skill jobs start to disappear, what we're really looking at is two new geoscience occupational zones. One which some of the mining companies have called are these geological cognitives. These are folks that are really good at the geologic problem solving. These are the students and colleagues that you have that you recognize can really think geologically, think in 4 dimensions, think spatially, cross scales, and really can get a grip across a lot of parts of the domain of the geosciences to understand what's happening with an earth process or system. The other side are what they call makers and sensors. These are the folks that they do know their geoscience, but they have a knack to apply a wide spectrum of science and engineering. They're very applied focused, because one of the key things that's being looked at is we need developers of new data feeds, new ways to collect data in the field, new instrumentation, new processing opportunities, things that will feed into, in essence, this machine learning augmentation that will then support some of the final solution processes by these geologic cognitive folks. So I would propose, just as a straw man, that to start conversation is a new labor pyramid. I don't think it should be a pyramid, but make it map to what we think. So in essence, you have this sort of this group that's very geoscience thinking, and then you have a group that's more applied and actually really looking at getting the data and understanding what's happening right there on the surface and with the rocks. So it's a straw man. Will it hold up? Don't know, but this is definitely the kind of directions that, if you are getting rid of what a lot of the occupations are, I think we would be heading towards. But I don't think one should look at this negatively. The president of minerals for BHP at PDAC back in March, he had a quote that really stuck with me during his keynote. And he said, with every retirement, we destroy a geoscience job. With every new hire, we're creating a geoscience job we can't even begin to describe. The new hires will define these jobs of the future. The fact of the matter is, we have an old vernacular. What the new geoscientists coming in, what that mid 21st century workforce is going to do, they're going to be using an entirely different set of tools. They're going to do something different. They're going to be solving problems in a different way. So it should actually be a very exciting time and a great opportunity, for students to help, or for new hires to start, defining the future of our discipline, within the economy. And I found it interesting. I pulled up some of the bullet points that Sharon Mosier has presented from her summit series about identify competencies from employers, and nothing's changed. So I mean, I think when you look at these competencies, earth science, habits of mind, working by analogy, inference, these are these big problem solving concepts. What we see as the needs within the education environment, and I think most of our programs really do strive for, aren't incompatible. I think it's about the framing. We see it even on the technical skills. Really, we need to keep pushing these quantitative skills, the problem-solving ability, data analysis, and I think the big one is the preparation for lifelong learning. Things are changing. We need to make sure our students are very much ready to continue changing with it. And then I think the field skills that for that big cognitive thinking process, that summary kind of process remains key. So I find it really interesting that these skills lists, which now are about, I think, 3 or 4 years old, absolutely remain completely current with the trends that we're seeing. So heading towards a wrap up here, some of the big emerging issues, that I see in general, some of the victories that the geosciences have had. I mean, we've had strong experience. We do have strong demand for field experiences. We've got 20% of our students saying they wanted to take a major capstone field experience, but were unable to get a slot. The salaries, folks that are getting hired, they're still getting good salaries, but they're a little bit lower, and that makes them a lot more sustainable. Hopefully, we'll avoid some of the cyclicity we've had. Our gender participation rates, they remain very strong for female participation. I think that's terrific. And the fact that for once where we always had these two cyclical sides with energy and mining, we had the environmental sector really absorb a lot of the slack over a number of years. It's a little softer right now, but times are changing. I think some of the challenges, we've seen sort of questions about the quality of some of our students and some of the deficiencies, as well as what does this whole issue, how are we preparing them, and how do we make sure the students are motivated, to continue achieving and not just think I want to go out. I'm fine. I'm going to go, log core for my life because I like rocks and I just want to collect a good salary. That they're going to have to enter a much more creative and dynamic workforce. So I think part of it too is looking at meeting this future on its terms. We can't change what's happening out there. And again, we sort of talked about the issue that some of the quantitative skills is not necessarily about calculating an eigenvalue. It's about understanding the principles within it. And so how do we actually get those mathematical concepts and mathematical thinking into the students to understand, so that they understand the systems they're working with better. Do we integrate things like basic machine learning, understanding that as a tool within it? How do we make that field experience and that mastering of geologic thinking something truly accessible to all of our folks, that is not a barrier for entry or pursuing a geoscience degree, but rather is a major attraction, which I think it had been probably for most of us that are on this webinar. And then I think the whole idea of this maker culture sort of existing, that's a little different, I think, for geoscience. The idea of getting a little bit more on the active engineering interface of the science can be really exciting, and I think can draw in a whole different set of creative students as well. So suggest feel free to go to our website, the workforce website at AGI. You can download the most current exit survey report for free from the site. If you have questions, if you send it to workforce@americangeosciences.org, myself, Carolyn, and Heather all get those emails, and we'd be happy to talk with you about that.
Great, thank you so much, Chris. That was a really great presentation, very informative. We do have several questions rolling in from the audience throughout the presentation. The first is asking about the exit survey, and she asked, doesn't the exit survey data represent graduates from all around the country, or is the survey, does it have skewed responses to have students only from particularly oily states? And so why do you see the drop in oil and the gas hires?
I think the survey goes across the board. I mean, Carolyn has that distribution of where folks responded. I have a copy in front of me. I can try to look, but I don't think that there's a over oily response rate. There's a lot from the Northeast, but we have quite a bit in in Texas and Oklahoma and in the Colorado area. So it's actually a fairly good geographic spread. And certainly representative across a lot of the different classes of universities. So the reality is that oil and gas did slow down a lot of hiring. Hopefully we'll see the increase again here with the price going up a little bit. But I think one of the other sides too, just like with mining, the new jobs really are not heavy up in the exploration side. They're a bit farther downstream. They're going to be at the reservoir level. In the development side, because there was such a binge of exploration that went on for quite a long time. So some of it's also there's adjustments going on at where the hiring is, and I'm not sure that we have aligned the student search process into those as well as we could.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, speaking of hiring and transitioning our students into the workforce, could you say a word about internships? We understand that, of course, internships are always a good thing, but students can get an early taste of the career setting and what's really going on, and employers get that introduction to the student. So Can you speak a little bit more about what we're seeing in internships?
Yeah, I think the internships remain incredibly important. If you download the report, the exit survey report, there's a whole section looking at the responses of internships. Unfortunately, only about half of the students seem to go out and pursue getting uh, internship opportunities. Uh, and you know, I agree. I mean, this generally is a positive. There's a high relationship on folks taking the internship and actually getting a job with that company or in that field. I think one of the other things I've seen over my career, and this is really important, is to make sure that students aren't always looking at just internships in the area of geoscience that they want. Um, I've met plenty of folks that reluctantly took internships in the oil and gas industry with no interest of pursuing a career in that. And a few changed their mind, but many walked out of it, and at least they had an appreciation for, say, that industry, what it was trying to do, what its limitations and opportunities were, and then learn. Yeah, I don't want to work there, but at least they have an appreciation. So I also think the other side is not allowing the perfect to be the enemy of the good as well, and whether or not because internship opportunities are not always sort of universally available, and I think that's one of the challenges because it's really hard for environmental firms, which are consultancies, to hire much in the way of interns. They don't really have the capacity to manage them, for instance.
Okay. Switching gears a little bit, um, we actually have several questions about diversity.
Hmm.
And the first is, in addition to the career paths, and how she was hoping that the presentation would address a little bit more about the demographics and the representation within the field. And you addressed some of the things about gender, but is there information about the race and ethnicity? And I know that you had described some of those challenges, but could you revisit those?
Yeah, I mean, I would suggest that really we can post some additional information. I would suggest looking at the SAS Geoscience Workforce Report, the last one that came out a couple years ago, where some of that long-term data is presented. Um, where that diversity exists, I think it's really hard to measure. If you're talking about within the workforce, because the ends are very low. So the data reliability is very, very poor. I mean, the
Mm-hmm.
aggregate numbers that we tend to actually get are somewhere in that 8% range. Qualify as underrepresented minorities. I think NSF comes in a little bit higher, uh, but by doing it by sector and things like that has been very, very difficult, just because of data privacy requirements.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, do you or AGI have data on the two-year college geoscience students? Are they mostly first-generation students? What would you say about those demographics? Because as you had stated earlier, we can really take a deeper look at our first degree college students and our
Mhm.
two-year college students.
I think it's a great point. We're just starting to really look at that, I think, in more detail. I know there have been a number of other groups that have been diving in more aggressively, trying to understand the composition of that community. Um, so I would defer. I don't know, Carolyn, if you're on and want to make a comment about some of the work you guys have been looking at in that issue.
Sure. It's really hard to, I'll first say it's really hard to track two-year college students because they come in and out of these intro classes in the two-year college, and it's hard to track them beyond their experience at two-year colleges and transferring in. However, the exit survey does ask if the graduates attended a two-year college, and so what we've been looking at is transfer issues and some barriers or challenges to completion of the degree by two-year college students. But we do find that about a third of our undergraduates spent at least a semester at a two-year college. And we know that the diversity is a little bit higher overall at two-year colleges based on federal data. So much of the work we're seeing is that this is a population of students that we should be targeting and making sure that their transition into four-year institutions is much smoother than it has been lately.
Great, thank you for that, for both of your responses to that question. We have another question about diversity and some of the numbers here. It is about what is the relationship between how we look at diversity and gather the diversity data and having the soft job market when we're seeing that a lot of our students may not be able to land jobs. Does that have any bearing on some of the diversity we see?
Yeah, I mean, there was to roll back, 15, 20 years ago, there were a number of groups that looked hard at that issue. Some of the folks at Fort Valley State and some of the companies, and you know, the recruitment of underrepresented minorities had a high relationship to the perception of the parents and the perception of the community about what that career track was. So it was always easy for them. They understood an engineer, a doctor, a lawyer. They understood things that existed in their community, and generally were always good for employment. Every time that we've gone out and been all overly, you know, public about the ups and downs in the geoscience job market, I think we do hurt that perception where we are making inroads. And so, I think engaging, whether it's first generation college students or whatever, the parental influence is extraordinarily important. I think we've seen the students become increasingly more job oriented. So if they view that the job market is soft, then there's a negative perception. I think on the other side of this, given every industry is cyclical, you wouldn't want to become a lawyer right now, for instance. That's a really tough job market right now. But you don't hear them beating themselves over the head about it. It doesn't seem to hit the news all the time. There's something about the way we as a community handle these ups and downs. It seems to over accentuate the problem, and I think that does make it a lot harder to recruit. I think the other side is to get folks to understand cyclicity. The best time to enter school is when the job market's bad. Because hopefully it's turned by the time you're coming out. You don't want to be being hired at the peak of the market. You want to be hired at the front edge of it. So I think that longer term view and maybe a bit our community being a little bit more copacetic when they're advising students about there are cycles. Every field has cycles. How do we prepare you for where and what cycle we're in is, I think, one of those keys. But but the more public, and I don't say hide our cycles, but the more public we become in bemoaning it, the harder it is, I think, to recruit, particularly some of these new emerging communities for our discipline.
Great, thank you. We do have one last really quick question before we have to sign off here. Do you know what the percentage of graduating geoscience doctoral students that are not able to find any jobs in the geosciences, the ones who leave?
I don't know. There's the person with all the answers.
So just to clarify, the exit survey is given to students at the point of graduation. So when you see percentages from the exit survey about who has a job, that's as they're graduating, they have found a job. However, last year I followed up, or this past summer, I followed up with 4 years worth of exit survey participants to ask them about their job progression up to their current time. And over 80% of PhD students do find a job in the geosciences, and the average time it took for most of our graduates to find a job was about 2 months.
That's fast. That's not bad at all. Great. Well,
yeah, I think I'll just add to that real quick. I mean, I think one of the challenges we face, if you look at STEM, you look at even Geo, The unemployment rate still remains in the 1.8% range. Um, it's far below even what the whole economy level is. So when we talk about a soft job market, it's actually still pretty good. I think part of it is about people finding in the specific sector, in the specific area that they're interested in. I think those are these additional hurdles that folks face when they're looking for those positions, compared to say looking at it very holistically at a systems level, say across the country.